let's dive into types of practice straight away and start thinking about part practice. And I've decided to kind of put down the base of what this is on the screen for you. So how do we do part practice? I'm using an example from swimming here. In fact, that'll be quite a consistent example through this tutorial. And please notice I'm not talking here about manual guidance, which we can clearly see going on in this particular images. That's not the focus of this, although of course you can combine guidance with practice types and this sort of thing. But here's how it's done. When we are doing part practice, we break a movement into its subroutines and we practice each subroutine separately, and clearly we can see some work going on the arm action to presumably some front crawl here. Now, what I want to do here is I want to address the evaluative nature of this. What are the strengths in green and what are the weaknesses in red of this mechanism? Well, the first thing is it's really good for low organisation skills. So a skill that can be broken down into subroutines, of course, called low organisational skills. So of course it's good for these. Secondly, it's also for complex skills. Now remember, complex skills are those with a high perceptual load, lots of decision making. If we can break those into smaller chunks, that can help. It's also really good for detailed coaching, okay, for detailed work. And I would specifically add to this the notion of fine tuning. Okay, so doing part practice is really effective at getting the real detail. Maybe this is all about this elbow getting a little bit higher, fine tuning that skill. Now there are of course weaknesses to this. The first one is that the performer is going to get no overall kinesthetic sense. So of course they're just going to be practicing sort of elements, subroutines of the skill. So they're not for quite a long time going to get a sense of what it feels like as a whole. That's a weakness. The performer may lack understanding. So because we're getting into the real sort of weeds of a particular technique, the real fine detail of something, that requires a lot of understanding on the part of the learner in this case. It's also, and this is a theme we'll come back to quite a bit in this tutorial, it's quite time consuming, folks. And what we mean by that, of course, if you've got to work on every single skill, it's going to take time, right? And also it's what we describe as far transfer. Now, far transfer has all kinds of issues, but in essence it means that we're not practicing like the thing is in real life or in the competition type match race type scenario. We call that far transfer. So those are the elements of part practice we use to evaluate. Now, of course, the other way of doing this is to do a whole practice. There are others, by the way. What is whole practice? Well, we do it by coaching an entire skill and we don't break it down to subroutines. So you'll notice here that I've sort of given like a swimming race with a whole different performer. And it doesn't have to be a race, but you can see this is the entire technique. This is the dive start, the stroke, the turn, if there is one, etc., etc., etc. So we do the whole thing together. So what's good and bad about this? Well, first of all, the positives, it's really good for high organisation skills. Okay, so if we're working with a high organisation skill that can't be broken down into subroutine, then it's really good for that. Secondly, is it develops a kinesthetic sense. Now let's assume it's the right kinesthetic sense. That of course is beneficial because then the performer can auto-correct and self-correct. It's also what we describe as near transfer. It's much more similar to what the person is going to experience in the actual event they're going to take part in. It improves fluency because, of course, they're doing the whole skill together. And the other thing, it's a really nice term for you to get into your answers. Try and get the wording of timing in. Whole practice is really good for timing and sequencing. It actually gets the whole movement clearer. It increases understanding, so the performer knows each part of this and they can sort of put those things together. It's really good for what we describe as ballistic actions, so actions that are particularly explosive. Think about a really powerful golf drive, for example. It's also really good for discrete skills. So a skill that has a clear beginning and end, we find that whole practice is particularly useful for them. And the other thing is that generally speaking, it helps to learn quickly, or at least to get to the point where you're doing the whole thing quickly, right? But again, there are drawbacks. What is it? Well, it's very hard for cognitive learners. Okay, so our novice learners are going to find this tricky because there's a huge amount to perhaps master here. They need probably skills to be broken down for them. It's also, and again these things overlap, it's also not particularly effective for young performers. Young performers are going to get kind of overburdened with this type of practice. It's also hard to isolate errors. Now I want to be clear here, it's not hard to detect errors, we're going to come back to that in a second, but it's actually hard to isolate those errors because you're doing the thing as a whole. You've also got the notion that some skills are too dangerous. So if I was doing an inversion on the trampoline for the first time, let's say a somersault, then it's not a good idea to do that as a whole practice to begin with, because I might get hurt. And also there's a lot to learn, and that might slow things down. Okay, so by breaking them into parts, maybe in our previous method, that might be more beneficial. Now that's all well and good, but are there alternatives? Well, yes, there is. We have the whole part whole practice. So how does this work? Well, we practice the skill as a whole. That's here. We then detect what the errors are in performance. We then isolate and practice those errors in part. Once we've done that, we put the skill back together again, we practice it as a whole, we confirm the errors are corrected, and then we'll find the other error and work on that. This is called whole part whole practice. So what's good about this? First of all, it is absolutely brilliant for serial skills. So anything which is a series of discrete elements linked together is absolutely superb. It's really good for routines. Oh, sorry, folks. Forgive me, I was actually writing from the wrong part of my paper there, going into autopilot mode. So let's scrub those. In fact, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of those bits altogether. Sorry, you lot. You must think I'm absolutely useless sometimes, but it's the reality of real life. So, strengths of whole practice. It's got the benefits. At least you know what's going to come on the next one, right? Benefits of whole and part. It's got the benefits of whole and part. So both whole and part are sort of maximized, I suppose. It's really, really good for error detection. Okay, so error detection is a really nice feature of this particular part. We've also got the notion that it's got detailed understanding of parts. So what I mean by that is, yes, we're doing the thing of doing the whole skill together, and that's really important from the kinesthetic perspective. But we've also got the detailed understanding of parts, and that can really help athletes to improve. Also, it's really good for what we describe as autonomous phase learners. So, autonomous stage. So really good quality learners and athletes will benefit from this a great deal. To finish off with, on this particular one, we need to look at the negatives. Well, the first one is it takes time. It's time consuming. It might not be also practical, and we'll come to that second. It's no good for groups. So if you've got to do this for groups, the errors could all be different. Therefore, it's more of an individual kind of process. And it's not practical for beginners. Okay, it's not practical for beginners. So the practicality of this is perhaps the issue. Can you maybe sort of reflect then that whole part whole is a brilliant model? The problem with it is just the practical, how do you actually go about doing it? Now, this is where I want to get kind of into the last bit of this. And I didn't put this in advance. I want to talk to you about progressive part practice. Now, I specifically didn't prepare this in advance because I really want, if I could spell it right, it would help, practice. So how do we do progressive part practice? Let me set it up in the same way I've done with the other ones. How do we do it? Well, the first thing we do is we take a part, we isolate it. So we've got a part, isolated, and practice. Now, there's no surprise there. That feels a bit like part practice, right? Well, that's absolutely true. But then what we do is we take the next part, and we isolate and practice. Now, this is kind of where it gets a little bit more interesting, right? What we're then going to do is we're then going to take the first and second and practice together. So the way I would summarize this for you is it's a model of chaining. So what we would do is, if I was practicing skill A of, let's say, the leg kick technique in breaststroke, I would practice that on its own. The next thing I would do is I would practice B. But then the next thing that I would do is I would practice A and B together. Now, B might have been the arm action. So I do the leg action, I then practice the arm action separately, then I practice them together. Maybe part C is the breathing technique. But what we do after that is that we then practice A, I've forgotten my colours, B and C together. In other words, we're chaining these movements together. We're building up this routine and this sequence. So what's good about it? Well, it's really effective for serial skills, especially routines. Really effective for that. Let me put the word routines in here because I think it's a really important one for you to grasp. It's also, it builds relationships between components. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this in something that has like aesthetic quality to it, like gymnastics, between elements. So I might have a great handstand, I might have a great tumble, but how do I connect those together? Progressive part practice is really good at developing that. But what are the weaknesses? Well, guess what? It's time consuming. Guess what? We've also got the notion that we've got no overall kinesthetic sense until the end, till the very end. So the kinesthetic sense only comes at the very end of the process when we put it all good. So it's no good for discrete skills, so we can't use it for discrete skills, so they're no good. It's no good for what we would describe as continuous skills. It's no good for them because, of course, by their nature of them, rules them out from this particular. And it's no good for high organisation. So all of those are kind of ruled out because, of course, the high organisation can't be broken down into parts. So there are 4 different types of practice, all of which you've now got an evaluative process to answer in your responses. Thanks.